Okay, we are going to talk about variables and lists. Now, a variable, we'll start out by talking about what is a variable. A variable is something that you can use in your program to temporarily store some information. So you can store numbers in there, you can store words, or any number of things that you can store inside of a variable. Okay, and why would you want to do that? There's any number of reasons why you could do it, why you might want to do it. You might want to, for example, keep track of the user's score if you're creating a video game, for example. And that information is something you would keep inside of a variable and then show it to the user whenever you need to show it to them. Or you might keep track of how many lives does that player have remaining. That's something that you would probably store inside of a variable. So there's so many things that you can store inside a variable. And as you continue to write scripts and programs in Scratch, and they get more and more complicated, you'll begin to really see that you have so many uses for variables in pretty much every program that you create. So to create a variable, you go into the blocks palette, you select the variables button here. That will highlight this, that will bring up the blocks palette for variable blocks. Now when you do that, you're going to see these two options: make a variable and make a list. So first of all, to make a variable, we're going to click on this make a variable button, and you'll see that this dialog box pops up, and what it's doing is it's asking me for the name of that variable. Now when you name your variable, it's very important that you select a name that describes how you're going to use it, because it's just a good habit to do that so that you can know, you won't get confused when you look at your script later on. So for example, if I'm going to use this variable to keep track of the score, then a logical name for the variable would be score. Now down here you see that there are two radio buttons. The first one says for all sprites, and the next one says for this sprite only. Now this is how we define the scope of the variable. The scope of the variable means how accessible is this variable? Who can use this variable? If we say for all sprites, then what we're saying is this is a global variable, or this is a variable that's accessible by anybody, by any sprite that I bring into this application, either now or later in the future, within this script, or sorry, within this project. If I say that this is for this sprite only, it means that only this sprite, which is right now called sprite 1, is going to have access to this. So since it's the score, let's go ahead and call it a global. Just for the sake of illustrating, I'm going to create that. It's a global variable called score. It's accessible by any sprite. Now I'm going to really illustrate this point by adding another sprite, and I'll just select one here for the sake of it. Let's take this B, we'll move him over. Now I'm going to go into the variable blocks, and you can see even within this sprite I already have access to this score variable. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another one, and this time I'm going to make it for this sprite only, and I'm going to call it the lives. So it's typical in many video games that, you know, each player has a certain number of lives, and then after you lose all your lives, then the game is over. So let's just say that we're creating something like that. This would be the lives, the number of lives that this particular player, the B, would have. So if I hit OK, now you can see over here we have the score variable, and we also have the lives variable, and you can see there's this little line in between them. Everything above this line is a global variable, and everything below this line is a local variable, local to that particular sprite. So if I go back and I select my first sprite, you can see he's got access to that global variable score, but he has no knowledge of the variable called lives, which was only pertaining to the B sprite. So that's the concept of a variable scope. So now that I have these variables, you can see that the two variable values actually appear on my stage, and basically these values are going to they will appear there as long as this button that's next to the variable name is checked. If I uncheck this one, so I uncheck score, you can see that the score disappears. And if I recheck it, then it reappears. If I go over here, I have to go to that, select this sprite for the local variable. I have to select a particular sprite that owns it. And if I uncheck it, then that will go away. And if I check it, it comes back. So that's the first thing that you'll notice about each variable. By default, it will display on your stage, and you can determine if you want to keep it there by using this checkbox. Now, for the sake of illustrating all these things, I'm going to keep them there so we can see how the variable values are changing as we manipulate them using these blocks. So when I do this, for each variable, there are 4 operations that I can perform from within my script. So the first operation I want to talk about is the set operation, and that's done with the set block. Now, what I can do, this is very straightforward, is I can set a particular variable to a specific value. Now, you'll see that there's a drop down here, and it contains a list of all the variables that are created. So if I say I'm going to set the score, or let's say set the lives to, say, 3. When I execute this block, and I can do that just by double clicking it for the sake of testing, when I double click it, you can see that sprite2 lives, okay, which is my lives variable owned by sprite2, that number just went to 3. Okay, I could also have another block if I want to set the score to, say, 100. There, now you see it sets the score to 100. So it's pretty straightforward how the set block works. Now, let's suppose I want to change something. So in a video game, let's say that you perform some kind of a mission and you gain some points. Maybe it's 50 points that you're going to gain. Well, in this case, we're going to change the score by 50. I don't know what the final score is going to be after I'm finished changing it. I don't know what it's starting out at. All I know is that what this player did is worth 50 points. So I'm going to change the score by 50. Now if I do that and I execute this block, you'll see that it jumped up by 50. If I execute it again, it jumps up by 50. And again, I can select the variable that I want to perform this operation on. So this is another block that's very useful to help you manipulate the value of your variables. And then finally, and by the way, you can decrease these variable values by inserting a negative number in there and changing it by a negative number. Of course, then you'll see the number decrease. Now, show and hide, essentially these two blocks allow me to do the same thing that I do by checking and unchecking this checkbox, except because it's a block, it means that you can do it from within your script. So if I say that I want to hide the variable called score, I double click it and you see to execute the block and it goes away. If I execute the show, it comes back. So I can do that from within my script. Now, as I'm programming, I may find that I no longer have use for a particular variable, and if that's the case, I can just simply delete it by clicking on this delete a variable button. When I click that, you'll see it'll show me a list of variables that are currently in the system. And what I'm going to do is delete this one called lives, and there it goes. You can see it's gone. Score still exists because I didn't delete it, and of course it's accessible from both sprites because that was my global variable. So that's how variables work. Let's talk about lists. And just for the sake of cleaning up, I'm going to delete this final variable here. Okay, so to create a list is basically very similar to creating a variable. But before we get into that, let's talk about what a list is. A list is, you can think of as a special kind of variable that holds multiple values. So if you think back to variables, what we just described about variables, they can hold a single value, and that value can be changed over time, but at any point in time there's only ever one value inside of a variable. However, with lists, A list is designed so that it can hold any number of values at the same time. So it can have 0 values, it can have 100 values, it could have 1,000 values. A list can have any number of values at any time, at any point in time. So the list is created by clicking on the Make a List button. When I click that button, once again, it's going to ask me for the name. And like with variables, it's important that the name you select is going to be descriptive of how you're using the name, of how you're using the list. So we're going to call this one phrases, because we're going to populate it with a group of phrases. And again, the scope of the list is just like the scope of the variable. It determines who has access to the list and who can actually use it. So if I select for all sprites, then it's a global list that all the sprites can use. And if I select for this sprite only, then in this case it would be the B sprite that only has access to these phrases. So I'm going to create this as a local list right now. I'm going to click OK. And when I do that, you see a few things happen. The first thing is that you see that the list itself is displayed by default on my stage. Just like the variables, I can make that go away by unchecking the box and make it come back by rechecking that box. So I have control over whether or not I want to actually display that. And if you look at this, you can see that the list is empty. It says empty here, and you can further confirm that it's empty because the length of the list is 0. Now the length of the list is actually another name for, or a way of describing how many elements are in the list. So an empty list, by definition, it has nothing in it, so the length is 0. So over here you can see that there are a few blocks that have opened up to us. The first block is the add block. Now we can add any value to our list. We can add any value to our list by simply using this block. This drop down will be populated with all the lists that have been created in the system. In this case, we only have one. It's called phrases. So let's add a phrase, hello world, to our list. Now when I execute this block, if you keep an eye on the list, you'll see that the phrase hello world has been populated into my list. We can add another phrase in here, goodbye. And when we click that, you can see that the phrase goodbye has also been added to the list. And one thing you'll notice is that when we use the add button, whatever we add to our list always goes to the end of the list. Now, we can also use this block to delete from our list. And you'll see that what we have to do is we have to select the position of the element. Which element do we actually want to delete? This gives us a few options. We can select the first element, the last element, or all the elements. If I select all, that means the list will go from however many it has down to 0. If I select last, then in this case goodbye will be deleted. And if I select one or the first, then the first element, which in this case is hello world, would be deleted. Now let me just illustrate one thing to you. I'm going to add another phrase to the list. Okay, I just added thing in position 3. If you look here, at first glance it appears that I have no way of deleting goodbye from the list, because 1 would give me the first phrase, which is hello world. Last would give me the last phrase, which is now thing, and all would give me everything. But you can double click on this and enter your own number. So I'm going to put the number 2 in there, and by doing that I can have it delete goodbye, which is in the second position. So if I execute this script, you can see goodbye is gone and we're left with only the hello world and the thing. Thing has moved down into the second position on my list. Okay, so the insert block allows us to add to the list in any position that we want. If you remember, the add block always put the new item at the end of the list. The insert block will put the item at any point in the list that you want. So we're going to add back the word goodbye, and we're going to add it. We can put it first, last, or in any position. If we say any, then that means we're going to allow Scratch to make the decision about where it should get added. And basically it's going to be random. It's going to put it anywhere that it wants to. We can also specify ourselves, just like in the last block. We can put a 2 there. And in this case, we should see that goodbye will be inserted in between the 2 existing list items. And there it goes. So now we have hello world, then we have goodbye, and then we have thing. If I want to insert a string, we're just going to put this we'll call it random. And we'll select any. Now when I insert, okay, you can see it's inserted it at the first position. Let me call this now random2. I'll execute the same block. Now you can see it went to the third position. So it's just selecting whatever it wants at that point, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Okay, the other block here is the replace block. So this allows us to take the existing items in the list, select one of them that we're going to replace with a different value. So again, we can do it to the first, the last, or any, which would be a random one, or we can specifically say which one we want. So in this case, let's replace the third item, which we have here as random2, with the word Scratch. And you can see when we execute this block, the list length stays the same, but the third element is now Scratch. So all we've done is we've replaced an existing value. Okay, now let's take a look at these 2 blocks down here. There's 3 here. We're going to talk more about this last one in a different section, but we're going to focus on these 2. So this one here allows us to actually retrieve the value of one of the list items. So if I select this drop down, again, first, last, any, and I can specifically call one out, like let's say 2. Now if I execute this block, it will show me a little bubble to tell me what the value is. And here you'll see hello world is the value of the second item in the phrases list. And here it is right here. Okay. If I say give me the last, we should expect it to say thing. Let's see. Execute it and you can see thing there. Okay, so this is how we can pull values off of our list and use them in our program. And then finally is the length of block, which allows us to find out how many phrases in this case are in our list, how many items are in our list. We can tell by looking at the list that the length is 5. So if we click on this, we should get 5. We have 5 different items in there. And here you'll see we do have, in fact, it does say 5. So if we delete one, let's pull this out and delete one. Now when we do it, you can see it's gone down to 4. So that basically wraps up the lists. Like I said before, this block here, the contains block, this allows us to find out whether or not the list contains a specific value. We're going to talk more about this when we get into the operators section. So for now, I'm going to put this back and we will we'll leave that one alone. Like the phrases, or sorry, like the variables, I can delete the lists by selecting the delete a list button, and you'll see when I do that, it will give me a list of all the lists that exist in the system right now. Currently, there's only one. It's called phrases. So if I select that, everything goes away.